Good afternoon, everyone. It's about 4 o'clock and it's time to begin our session for addressing challenging behaviors. My name is Chris Secan and I'm the Fortunate Supervisor of the Autism Unit. And I want to take a moment to ask our presenters to introduce themselves, starting with Emily.
Hello all and welcome. My name is Emily Stanley and I'm an instructional specialist with the autism program and glad you could be here today.
Lauren.
Hi, I'm Lauren McGinley. I'm a program specialist with the Autism Unit.
And Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lisa Grants. I'm an instructional specialist with the Autism Unit.
So before we go further, I want to make sure that anyone who needs to use closed captioning scrolls down to their control bar, clicks live transcripts, and then shows subtitles. Okay, before we go further, I want to make sure you're in the right place. So today's session was designed for those discrete programs that are coming back to school March 1st, although I understand we've opened up and are welcoming programs and staff from programs that are returning on March the 15th. But this session was primarily designed for those staff in autism, LFI, school community-based, extensions, and special schools. I do want you to know that while all staff presenting today are from the Autism Unit, this professional development really was the collaboration of a group of people across schools and services. So Emily and Lisa are instructional specialists with the Autism Unit. Lauren and Mark Custer are program specialists in the Autism Unit. Megan Sullivan and Ashley Doyle from Central Support Services in the Department of Special Education. Elisa Bell and Tanya Williams-Walker from the PEP program, and Jessica Jordan from the Extensions program did the bulk of the work on developing this session. Additionally, we had input from stakeholders through the Alternate Learning Outcomes Steering Committee and selected teachers, as well as a group of paraeducators who worked with us on a professional day to listen to our pilot and give us feedback. I want you to know that not only so that you know that there were many stakeholders involved, but so you know how very much care was put into this session. This session was designed really to address problems and concerns that people stated on return to school. So if we could go to our next slide, please. We have a slightly different process for each section of today's presentation. Although we see the chat, I think we're probably going to disable it and not attend to it moving forward because it's very distracting to try to answer so many questions popping up in a chat as you present. We have a capture sheet that will be posted in the chat, and we're asking you to go to that Q&A link during each section. Attendees, you can add your questions to the Q&A during each section, and then add a star next to existing questions that you really want to hear more about. We're asking, if possible, for you to avoid repetition because our intent with this presentation is to try to answer some questions as we go along, but to verbally address some of the questions that really represent overarching themes or consistent challenges or questions from the group. We'll review the Q&A at the end of each section. And that's when we'll address those common clarification questions. Although we would like to tell you everything you'd like to know, only questions relevant to this presentation will be addressed today for the most part. So next slide, please. If you are in a March 1st group, you have already had the opportunity to take PPE and classroom setup. If you're coming back March 15th, those options will also be presented to you. We don't have answers today about vaccinations, schedules, staffing, or ADA accommodations. Those of you in the March 1st groups should have already received, because they are in your schools, an individualized PPE kit containing a face shield, mask, goggles, gowns, gloves, and hand sanitizer. Additionally, schools will be receiving extra supplies of gowns and gloves, and we're working on a replacement supply chain for all of those most important things, particularly our enhanced masks, gloves, and gowns. Next slide, please. If you've taken the earlier PDs, you've heard this before, but we probably can't say it enough. We want you to know that decision-making started for everything that we are involved in considering health and safety. Your health and safety, as well as the health and safety of your students. Our next consideration was around service delivery. In light of looking at our cohort practices, our PPE, where we're going with our professional development, and the instructional models that you'll be implementing in your schools. We're trying to balance the service delivery then with those administrative concerns that take into account how do we schedule, how do we keep people safe, how do we deliver the services that are on students' IEPs. Next slide, please. We've worked hard, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about the constant effort to create evidence-based health and safety plans. We feel that that's it's important for everyone. It's most important for our group returning March 1st. You know about county and community protective measures. And if you've been in your schools, you've heard about what's happening in your school community. Where we really landed was on the importance of the cohort community. I want to make clear that as we talk about maintaining stable cohorts in our phase 1 groups, that it's about safety for everyone. It's about safety for the staff in the classroom. It's about safety for our students who are going to be lagging behind our staff in vaccinations. It's about safety for all of us as we learn about the effects of the vaccine and whether or not we can still transmit disease. So while it may feel, if you're a classroom teacher or a paraeducator, that the cohort was designed to keep everyone else safe, please bear in mind that's not true. We're looking hard at keeping you safe, and we're looking hard at keeping the kids safe. The last piece of this graphic talks about your individual responsibility for your safety. We all know that we have different levels of comfort around moving in a classroom, moving in a school now, but that we all bear individual responsibility for contributing to our cohort and our school community. I think we've learned that community is what will keep us all safe in the end. Next slide. We've talked to you about, or you're now hearing about, a strong recommendation to talk about community norms. And that community can be your classroom community, it can be your cohort community, and it can be your school community. We want you to identify your values, your communication style, and always remember that we are talking about keeping things student-centered. Next slide. We have some recommendations for building community, and that is to begin to collaboratively identify the values of your cohort, whether that's being on time, whether that's how you use your PPE, whether that's how you interact with one another. This is a time above all for honest and respectful communication. My secretary had to tell me today to please put my mask on while I was running up and down the hall in the office, to listen to one another, to hold yourself accountable, and always remember to keep our students at the heart of our decision making. Next slide, please. So I'm going to interrupt my presentation because we have a special guest. I need to find our special guest, our Associate Superintendent, Mr. Kevin Lowndes, and make him a co-host. If one of my co-presenters who's a co-host could also find that, my Chromebook is not participating with me at the moment. So while we're making Mr. Lowndes co-host, I want to let you all know that this is the first time in a very, very long career that we've had an associate superintendent who was so motivated and dedicated to coming to address our teachers, our paraeducators, and expressing concern for you throughout this process. Is Mr. Lowndes a co-host now?
Yes, he should be.
So for some reason, Chris, I can't turn on the video, but I first want to thank Chris and her crew, Emily, Lisa, and Lauren, for providing this training, and not only providing it, but developing it to make sure that our staff are safe and understand what needs to happen in order to stay safe, and stay safe not only for them, but their students when we return to school. I asked Chris if I could stop by today because I wanted to thank everyone. It's a time I know where folks are a little bit nervous about returning. But I do want to say that, you have done a tremendous job in helping our families during this very difficult time. I've received many emails saying that, their children are the happiest when they get on with their classmates during the day in the Zooms, in that how, when they're maybe misbehaving at other times, when they get the opportunity to be with their peers, it really brightens their day. As you know, some of our students are not able to access the distance learning because of some type of disability, and their parents are anxious to have them back into schools. And the amount of work that folks have done, and you as teachers returning and paraeducators returning to the buildings have done to prepare for a safe return is very admirable. I mean, it's incredible what everyone has done to be able to prepare for March 1, not only to teach our students that are returning to the building, but to maintain that instruction for our families that have chosen to stay at home. I know it's a difficult ask, but you have all risen to the occasion, and I can't thank you enough for being able to do that and to spend time this week preparing your classrooms, attending these trainings, as well as continuing to teach our students. So I just wanted to make sure that you knew that I how thankful I am of all of your work and your commitment to your families and especially to your students. It does not go unnoticed, and I appreciate it very much, but your parents appreciate it tremendously as well. Sometimes they don't always show it, but I can tell you they are very, very thankful for all the hard work that you've done to support their children during this difficult time. So Chris, thanks for letting me interrupt. I'm sorry I did. I'm sure they'd rather hear you and your team than myself, but I just wanted to make sure that I came by to say thank you. And I look forward to seeing folks back in the buildings.
Thank you, Kevin. It's not unnoticed that you joined us, so thank you. See you later.
Bye.
So before Kevin joined us, we were talking about how to create community norms within your cohort. And you've probably read this slide while we waited. So you don't need me to tell you how to meet as a team, but if you do have struggles as you talk with your team, reach out to people in your school, reach out to anyone who can help you facilitate a conversation if it becomes difficult. Many of you have shared with us that you're worried that you don't all hold the same values or have the same social life. And so sometimes those are difficult decisions and discussions. And I would urge you, if you feel over your head with a team or team members, because many of you work in classrooms with up to 7 or 8 people, reach out for support in facilitating that. Next slide, please. So here's a sample of classroom norms that our colleagues in the extensions program created, and we'll all laugh at bullet number 1, except we won't, because I think we've all had the difficult chore of asking someone who's coming in and out of a space to wear their masks over their noses. But these are examples of a classroom, a set of classroom norms they created, and a nice example for all of us. One of the things that we really hope that you take away from today's presentation is that we really, really urge you to rewire and reset your thinking. We're coming back to school in a totally different circumstance, and we have to let go of all of the things that we held on to prior to the pandemic. We all need to be flexible, no matter what our role in the school system is, and change our mindset because we have new expectations coming at us, and you will be working under truly exceptional circumstances. We've been doing a lot of problem solving over the last few months, and I can't tell you enough that the problems or the solutions that we came up with that were the most elaborate were the ones we dropped immediately. I'm a great one for an elaborate plan, and most of my plans are not sustainable. So I've learned, and I hope you learn too, that those simple solutions are the ones that will work for us in the long run. And when you're struggling for a solution to a problem, try to boil it down. Next slide, please. Please remember, this is new for everyone. Teaching is not new for any one of you. Working with kids in the pandemic is not new for you, but being in the building during the pandemic is going to be new for all of us. I value working with many of you because many of you are perfectionists. You want everything to be perfect and right and the best for our kids and your colleagues, but not every solution or not every teaching moment is going to be perfect. I know one of our challenges is going to be patient with ourselves and with those around us. More and more as we approach Monday, I see the difference in how we're all approaching things, how we feel. And I think it bears all of us reminding one another to be patient together. When I think about the errors that I make on a daily basis, reflecting on them really does help me grow. And I'd urge you to take a breath and do that as well. Next slide, please. So it's not too late, even though it's Thursday, to advocate and collaborate for the needs of your cohort in classrooms. The reason we put this slide in here is not that your administration are not looking out for you, because you know better than we do that they are. But we did find in our early conversations with administrators that they weren't necessarily being mindful of some of the things that we would like to have for our students, that we would like to be scheduled in rotations in a gym, that we would like to be able to access a specific playground at certain times. When those questions were raised to administrators, they all said, oh, of course, certainly. Would you like something else? But because of multiple tasks that everyone's juggling, they may not be thinking forward to offer you those things. So I'd urge you right now, before everybody else comes back to school, reach out about things that you're thinking, I'd love to use that room. I'd like to have that access to that playground. And reach out to those in your school who are supporting you, whether you're at the elementary or high school level. Again, if it's a difficult conversation, enlist other people to help you facilitate that. Now is the time. Next slide, please. All right, so at this point, I'm going to turn our presentation over to our wonderful presenters, and we'll be back later and we'll be monitoring the Q&A.
Hello, everybody. Welcome again. We do appreciate that you're here staring at a screen for yet another 3 hours after your long day. So thank you. Just to remind you about the capture sheet that Chris mentioned earlier on. So I will be reviewing some objectives, talking about a different way to, not really a different way, but for some of you may be a new way to really think about behaviors. There's, as you saw, Lauren dropped the capture sheet in there. And so the first section on that capture sheet will be on pairing. So as I am presenting, and if you have questions or anything relevant that you wanted to share, please feel free to do so. So with that, let's start. Not that we haven't started, it's just a great job there. Let's kind of start talking about behaviors and addressing those behaviors kind of in the age of COVID back in our classrooms. So not every behavior and situation are going to be addressed. There's just going to be some behaviors that may occur in the classroom that you will have to discuss as a team that are a little bit more obscure. But we will do our best, and certainly if you bring any behavior that you're thinking about up in the capture sheet, we can certainly address that. So let's talk about the first objective. So we need to learn how to approach behavioral challenges from an updated perspective. And that updated perspective is really about what Chris said earlier, about kind of rewiring our brains, rethinking how we might approach those behaviors. The principles of good behavioral program and applied behavior analysis we're still going to use, but we might be tweaking it a bit, and strategies that we used in the past, we might for the time being not be using them. And we'll talk a little bit more about why during the presentation. So we're also going to talk about how to pair the process of pairing and demand fading in my classroom, in your classroom, and we'll talk about what that really means, pairing. Some of you, you've heard that word or that term before. For other of you, might be a brand new term. We're really going to talk about incorporating functional communication training throughout the instructional day. Hopefully this was going on pre-COVID. This becomes much more critical. It's always critical, but we really need to be making sure we're focusing on that. And then we're going to review those proactive and responsive strategies to common behavioral problems. So we're going to talk a lot about best practices that should be in place. And then if a behavior does occur, we're going to review what antecedent or proactive strategies should always be in place. And then if the behavior does occur, what would be good responsive strategies given our age of social distancing and the like. Next slide, please, Lauren. So changing expectations. So as Chris mentioned, our priority is health and safety for everyone. So we may need to adjust some of our strategies that we used before. And again, I'm talking about teachers and paraeducators in the autism program and extensions and SCB. Some of the strategies we might have used might be running kind of escape extinction procedures where we might be working a child through a demand or a procedure, and I'm not going to get into what they are, but transition interruption. We're probably not going to be running those procedures too much because sometimes they may trigger a more behavioral issues. So we use those strategies within the context of a robust behavior intervention plan with many other antecedent strategies in place, but we're not necessarily going to be looking at those right now. And then the second bullet here, initially you may not be able to perform or teach at 100%. That's okay. I have the honor of working with amazing teachers who give 110, 150%. When we go back into the building, we need to realize that things are going to take a little bit more time. We are going to we'll talk about pairing in a couple of slides, and we'll talk about what that means. But even things like bus arrival and at schools may take a little bit more time. Procedures that need to occur in the classroom may take a little bit more time. So we might be only giving 70% of ourselves to instruction and taking care of some of those other tasks. And that is okay. You need to be able to give yourself a pass on that. We know some of our children did quite well during virtual instruction, but for many of our children, it was difficult, and it was really difficult for their families. So 70% of in-class instruction is probably qualitatively and quantitatively better than what many of our students were receiving virtually, especially those students who are just having a hard time accessing the screen and coping with that digital format. Next slide, please. So again, rewiring our brains. That is going to be the soundbite of spring of 21. I reviewed the first point here, and I reviewed the second one, and then the third one. What does that mean? It's okay to use previous strategies that were effective and students have outgrown. What I really think for this third point here is our students in our secondary classrooms, middle school, but especially high school. For those students who they may have in the past when they were in elementary school and early middle school, relied more on those specific reinforcement systems like coping economies. And as students age in our ALO programs, we do try to wean them off of those secondary reinforcement systems because we're trying to get them ready for more natural schedules of reinforcement that they will be expected to tolerate within the adult services world. But if you have to go back, and this is especially for the secondary teachers who've joined us today, if you need to revisit token economies and other similar strategies for your students as they're coming back into the building after a year being out, you probably need to look at that. And really, our global goal is to avoid escalation. And so there's a CPI resource. We really want to think about that. You can click that link on your own time, but that second piece here is avoid the power struggle. Really think about where you are, where your body is next to that student, and really think about not getting engaged in power struggles, not kind of thinking he's doing that to annoy me. He should know better. He's not respecting me. That's kind of all mentalistic assumptions about behavior. So as we talk about pairing, hopefully we won't even have to think about avoiding power struggles with students, but really that's so important. So next slide, please, Lauren.
Emily,
Mhm.
your microphone is going in and out. I think it's as you move, so just kind of be aware of that, please.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. So again, I talked a little bit about this earlier. Behaviors that we will not be able to address as we typically would. We are not going to start physically prompting a student through a task and using that graduated guidance for compliance or anything like that. We really are going to let go of those procedures. Those procedures would have only been written in well-developed behavior intervention plans anyway. But as we look at and revisit behavior plans for students as they come back, the school team is really going to have to look at some of those procedures if they're outlined in that behavior plan. So when we really need to think about kind of ignoring those minor behaviors and letting them go. We probably should be ignoring minor behaviors anyway and kind of asking the million-dollar question, why is the student engaging in that behavior? Ask the question, let's take the data and figure out why the student is engaging in that behavior and then come up with a replacement behavior. In terms of some behaviors need to be on an IDLP, we really need to discuss that as school teams, as students come back into the class. Okay, so before I talk about pairing, the one other consideration I really want you to think about is that we know that our students really benefit from a lot of those planned motor breaks, getting up out of the chair, getting that kind of heavy work in. So we need to make sure when we are developing our schedule that students have those frequent opportunities for movement, and that we're considering flexible seating. I see we have some OTs here, so hopefully they'll be happy with our little flexible seating bullet here. And if students benefit from those bowl chairs or wobble chairs or standing desks or TheraBands, we need to make sure they're in place in the classroom. And then again, if we wondering about or we're worried about elopers, students who elope, making sure that where the student desk is, where the teachers are relative to the door, that kind of thing. One of the big bullets here is be mindful of shared materials and try to limit. It's going to be really important for that to happen. And then if students are sharing materials, the classroom staff needs to think of a way of sanitizing those materials then before they're delivered to another student. Next slide, please. I'm going to ask my colleagues here, is everything okay with my sound?
So it's still breaking up a bit.
Okay.
If you don't move and kind of make sort of face forward towards the computer,
Yeah.
it seems to be a little bit better.
Okay. Is it just fading out, or you're having a hard time hearing me?
It's
It's
fading
actually-
in and out.
Yeah.
Okay, I have my volume all the way up. Okay, I'll try to talk loud as well.
That works perfectly where you are.
Okay, I will not move.
Don't move.
Okay, so when we talk about pairing, what is pairing? Again, for those of you who've joined us from the autism program, the extension program, and some in the SCB program, this is probably not a new term or practice that you do. When new students come into our program, what our first goal is, if we don't, obviously if we don't have a history with that student, is to really make a happy, engaged learner. We want relaxed, happy, and engaged. And so when students first enter our program, we create hopefully what is borders on paradise for them. And the reason why we do this is that we want students enjoying coming to school, enjoy coming to the classroom, and enjoying interacting with us as instructors. So pairing or building a rapport with the learner is an essential component of good teaching. A positive relationship between the instructor and the student sets the stage for successful teaching and enables our learner to reach their optimal outcomes. Everyone is anxious typically for instruction to start immediately, but pairing is just as important, maybe even more so. Pairing develops the strong foundation upon which all good instruction and teaching is built. Without this strong foundation, we will not be effective teachers. Additionally, pairing never ends. Even after the foundation is built, we need to maintain it and keep it strong. So we're going to talk a little bit more about pairing, but we're going to show a video on what pairing will look like. We unfortunately were not able to get any videos with people wearing masks in terms of or socially distancing, but we really wanted to show a good illustration of what pairing looks like in general. The video you're going to see talks about treatment center and clients and therapists. So really think about classroom, teachers, paraeducators, and students as you hear that terminology. So Lauren, if you could play the video, please.
Hello, welcome to the start of our Rise from ABA training. We're excited to start this journey with you all. My name is Monique. And my name is Sophia. And we're registered
Emily, this is not the right video, correct?
No.
It's in the notes, I believe, Lauren.
Yeah, okay. Okay, I can't find it. I'm sorry. Is it here? Hold on. Is that it? No.
No.
It looks like the link is gone.
Okay, well, that's too bad. I apologize for that. That was working perfectly on Saturday. So let's just move on with the slides. And if we can, if we can find that video, we can just send it to people or put it in the PowerPoint or something. Okay. So next slide, please. So pairing, as I said, is the process by which you connect yourself with all of the learner's favorite items and activities. So one of the things that you really need to think about as you're approaching our first week with students returning, do I have everything that all of our students, that my students like? And again, some of our students will return to the building, they'll be ready to go, but remember, they've been out of the building for a year, And so it is going to take a while for them to get routinized and just used to the classroom. And so we really need to think about making sure that even if we have a history with the student and we say, oh, he'll be fine, there won't be any problem with him returning, and I can start instruction at the table straight away. I think we need to be really careful about those assumptions. Pairing is the process by which you connect yourself with all of the learner's favorite items and activities. And through these repeated connections, you take on the value of good stuff and become the ultimate reinforcer. What we really mean by that is that students are approaching you. And again, I know we keep our distancing in mind, but the students really want to be with you. And so when we then start morphing in or fading in those instructional demands, it's hard for the students to discriminate what's fun and what's an instructional demand, because you in yourself have become so much fun. You've established that's what we call instructional control. Next slide, please. So how do we pair?
Emily,
Yes?
we did find the video if you want to show it before getting into how to pair.
I think that would be great. Thank you. We don't have sound though, right?
Can you hear it?
No.
No.
Well, I can narrate a little bit of it if you just want to play it. So what this nice gentleman here is saying is he's really emphasizing the importance of pairing and how it really leads to, as I said, those happy, engaged, relaxed learners. And how pairing, as I said before, is that cornerstone, the foundation for all good instruction. And so what you'll see here is different staff people just pairing lots of fun activities with students. And as we're pairing with students, we're not making a whole lot of demands. So that lady there might be showing the tiger or just giving it to her, but she's not asking her right now, what is it? What color is it? What does the tiger say? We're making sure it's just about fun. We can certainly narrate a student's play, but we're not going to be making all those demands. What color is the train? What does the train say? What do you want now? We will do that later on, but initially during the pairing process, we are the giver of all good things and we're just giving them for free. And again, it's just about having fun and really looking at, building up those kind of joint attention skills and really establishing that practice or that skill where the student is approaching you all the time. And so these examples are things that we're not going to say during pairing. No, wait, stop. Can I see that? Hey, look at me. That's kind of a turnoff for many kids initially. So we're not going to do that. We will do it eventually, but not right now, but not at the initial stages of pairing. The goal really is to have fun. It's okay to be goofy. It's okay to look silly. I kind of like this part of the video because I tell people that they do not really have to learn to do a backflip on a trampoline. It really is okay to have fun and just and make sure that we are incorporating that pairing process all day long, especially as students return to the building. And we'll talk about demand fading later, we're probably, you're probably saying, well, we can't do that all day long. We can't. We can do it for the first few days. Pairing never really stops. It can last. There's no set time limit. There's no set strategy. It can last for several hours, several days, several weeks. I think when we talk about pairing in terms of coming back to the building, we really need to be open to pairing lasting at least a week and maybe more for many of our students. So again, we will have to think about pairing as it relates to social distancing in classrooms, but we can still do it. We're probably not going to have as much up close and personal fun, but we can still have fun. And again, it's too bad you can't hear the audio on this, but she's just having fun with him. She's not making any demands. She's just engaged in play with him and is joining him in what really motivates him and interests him. So happy, engaged kids. Okay, I think we've gone through a few slides after this, Lauren. Okay, I think this is where we were, thank you. So again, really allow them to have access to preferred items, parallel play to the extent you can, safely and enjoy yourself, make comments, not questions. One of the things that we do want to make sure that in terms of the pairing process, that you are really controlling all those good things and reinforcers. So we're giving them for free. We're not being stingy with them. We are certainly giving them for free. But if a student is engaged in a problem behavior during the pairing process, we are going to block access to all of those reinforcers until the student, so if the student starts crying, let's say, or just engaging in low level vocal kind of whining behavior, we're probably not going to give all those good things. We're just going to wait until it stops. We're obviously going to make sure the student is safe. We're not going to give a whole lot of eye contact. And then once that behavior stops, pairing starts again. If we are pairing sufficiently, we probably shouldn't be seeing any behaviors at all, because again, we are developing, creating, establishing those happy, engaged learners. As I said before, continue, pairing never ends. Even when we get back into more instruction, we should be doing pairing at the beginning of instructional sessions, at the end of it, and throughout the day. Next slide, please. So again, a little bit repetitive here, but I don't think you can hear this enough. You will control the reinforcers, and you're going to obviously continue to allow access to them. And then you're going to start adding in very easy demands. But remember, they're having so much fun that these demands are not going to be that discernible to the student. And the demand could be just the student now starts requesting if they're playing with a train set that they've gotten 3 trains for free, and they have to request the 4th one. And then gradually start, then we're going to talk about that demand fading. That's what we call it, until the student is completing their work to earn those reinforcements. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so goals for pairing. And again, this is really just for your reference when you get home tonight and you're looking at your PowerPoint. Stage 1, no demands. Stage 2, they can make a choice or demand for preferred activities. That word demand really means they can request. Really think about who your student is as a communicator. whether it is vocal or whether it's using PCS or whether they're using sign or a combination of all of that. And then, so asking for more of an activity. Again, those, if the child has 3 of the pieces of the train set and they need the 4th piece to complete that train. And then, you know, stage 4 is tolerating staff interacting with materials alongside the student. And so that's the stage where we can maybe start fading in what color or what does a cow say if they're playing with the farm, that kind of thing. So how long to pair? Pairing is a process and will last different lengths of time for each student. There is no rule in terms of length of time for pairing. And again, we should always be revisiting pairing with all students. And this goes for preschoolers to secondary students. It might look different, but certainly we should be pairing with all students across the age band or grade bands and age levels. We're going to make sure we're going to set goals for each stage in pairing. And then we're going to collect data. And it could be very kind of simple data in terms of, is the student, has the student engaged in any behaviors while we're pairing? If the answer to that is no, and we have good data, then that gives us, that informs us to say we can now start slowly fading into maths. So again, these bullets here, or these points here, are pretty self-explanatory, but these would be certain criteria that we would be looking for in terms of pairing and moving on to more instruction.
Hello.
Next slide, please.
Yeah.
Okay. So before we go to the capture sheet, I would like to just read a quote by a famous researcher in the field of applied behavior analysis and pairing and toleration training in general. His name is Greg Hanley. And I found this over the weekend, or actually last Friday, and I shared it with the 2 sessions that we held on Saturday. And what he said was, and it really kind of speaks to the pairing process and making sure that we're de-escalating behaviors all the time, and we're not getting engaged in any kind of power struggle. So what Dr. Hanley said was, ours is not to dominate, but to de-escalate, or better yet, prevent escalation in the first place. Ours is not to coerce, but to listen, learn, guide, and coach. Ours is not to redirect, restrain, or merely manage and modify. Ours is to understand, share, and shape. Ours is to prioritize safety, rapport, and the televisibility of what we do above all else. Okay, so we will look at the capture sheet, and then before we move on to our next section, sorry.
Okay, so it looks like we have been answering a lot of the questions as we have been talking. Just so everyone knows, the behavior questions, there's some specific elopement and other types of behaviors. Those are certainly going to be answered later in the presentation. I think we touched on this, so pairing examples look great pre-COVID. What strategies can be shared in this environment? So we obviously don't have any videos or examples pre-COVID, but we just have to remember to think about everything we've learned in our other PDs. So we want to think about using your PPE, and then we really are going to have to be able to be creative and rethink all kinds of the strategies that we've been using, trying for the greatest distance. So you might have to rethink certain activities that you would be doing with a child. But I think just using that PPE and then the behavior strategies and adapting them is going to be the most effective. Do you guys have anything to add to that?
Well, I actually do.
Emily,
so
we can't hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
I can.
No.
You can't. Okay. You can hear?
Yep.
Okay. So the other pieces, this came up on Saturday as well. We're going to have our masks on. So we want to look happy and effusive with our students, but they're not going to see our smiling faces. We can still really use our bodies, and we can be jumping up and down if we're healthy enough, or, you know, if you're not old like me. And really, we can project that enthusiasm even if our faces or our mouths are covered. We really can. We all have smiling eyes. And we can do a lot of things to really project that enthusiasm, whether it's thumbs up, clapping, yay, all of that. So we really, we probably have to get probably a little bit more dramatic with our body language, given that we're going to be, we're going to try to maintain that social distance to the extent that we can. But I do think that our students will respond to that. And so we can do that. So we're not going to be getting up on a trampoline with them like you saw in the video, but we can be giving them their favorite videos on their Chromebook, and we can be behind them and say, wow, look at him, he's, you know, and just enjoying the characters that they're watching or the song. And if you don't mind, because some kids don't want to sing their songs for them, like sing even a refrain or a line of the song. We just have to get creative. And again, don't worry about looking goofy. Nobody will mind.
And the only thing I would add is that while our goal is to have that social distancing, we do know that some of our students are going to struggle and are going to need a little bit more of that proximity. And that's where the additional PPE comes in, and that it might be that we might need to kind of be a little bit closer to our students for whether it's for behaviors or in order to pair effectively. And then you would just, you know, make sure that PPE is being used.
Okay, so we are going to move on to the next section. I will say that if you have questions about any of the upcoming slides, to make sure to put them on section 2 on the capture sheet. And the title there is Reinforcement and Demand Fading, just so we can try to keep your questions organized. Okay, so Emily gave all of that information there about pairing. And before we move on, I just want to talk about all of this pairing information is not new. It's research-based. It's been around for 50 to 60 years. I think it's important to note that some programs, some special education programs use the pairing process more than others, especially for our younger students. So when our pre-K students start school at age 3, we're certainly engaging in a lot of pairing. And so it may be more familiar to our pre-K or elementary teachers. But with this current situation, we really feel like these practices should be implemented in all classrooms, just because it will promote willing learners. Emily was talking about relaxed learners, and that really is what we want going back to school. It truly is a best practice, and these principles should be part of everyday instructional practices even after COVID. Like we said, it's a best practice. It creates positive relationships, and if you look down at the bottom of that first slide there is a how-to guide that's very long, but if you would like more information about pairing after this presentation, you can certainly check out that link. Here at the top of the slide, we do have the official definition of pairing. So the process of where you establish yourself as a reinforcer to build a positive relationship with a student. And when you're pairing, you associate a neutral stimulus, which in this case is the adult, so the teacher or the paraeducator, and your words with something that is already reinforcing to the child. So on the video, you saw a child playing with trains because they were demonstrating pairing. That child, it was already known. I'm assuming that trains were a known reinforcer to that kid. And so we're going to move forward in the presentation and talk a little bit more about reinforcement. Okay, so what is reinforcement? A reinforcer is an item that is given after a behavior, and this can be any behavior. It can be a learning behavior, so responding to a demand. It can be a classroom routine behavior, so sitting in their chair when they're supposed to. And that item that you give after that behavior is to increase the likelihood that the behavior will happen again. A reinforcer is something that your child will work for. So this is individualized. Each classroom team should really have a repertoire or a variety of reinforcers that we are known to be motivating for a child. And so when we head back into schools, we should really be doing some of those informal reinforcement assessments to figure out what is continuing to being reinforcing for a child, because it may have changed from when we last saw them. If you go down to the bottom of that slide there is a link. It says potential reinforcers. Some of them, again, this is not an exhaustive link of what could be reinforcing for a child, and some of them may not apply to our current pandemic circumstances. However, it will give you a good idea of a list of where to start if you're trying to determine what is reinforcing for a child. Okay, so one of the things that we have to remember is we want to be the giver of all good things, and that is helps the pairing process helps with that. So we have to remember that we cannot reinforce too much. I think when we return back to school, we have to really know that we should reinforce as much as possible. When we're thinking about this presentation, we really want you to think of reinforcement as the first health and safety measure, because if we are able to reinforce often with things that we know are motivating to a child, that will certainly decrease a lot of those problem behaviors. So it really is just very important to remember your reinforcement schedules, which we'll talk about, because it really is the first strategy that will help prevent those problem behaviors. We're going to talk through problem behaviors a lot in the second part of this presentation. And so we know that reinforcement is certainly not the end all be all, but it will help prevent a lot of behaviors. And so I talked a little bit about this a second ago. We want to incorporate a variety of rewards and choice for our children. So again, having a list of things that you know is reinforcing for children, not using the same thing over and over, because it will lose its effect if we continue to use the same thing. And giving our students choice is certainly a way to continue to motivate them. We want to make requesting easy when we go back to school. We want to, we're going to talk a little bit about fading in demands in a second, but we really want to stress to you that this is not the time to teach a new sentence structure or to teach the start of using a device. When we get back on March 1st, we really want to know that a child is able to request easily. So if they request with one word, we should honor that request. It's not the time to really stress that they need to use 2 to 3 words if that's where they are. We want to be able to give up those things for them following directions and responding to demands. Every student should have an individualized reinforcement system or schedule. And so what that means is that it should be determined how often a child really needs reinforcement, how long are they able to work without showing problem behaviors. And this is really determined through data, but to know when we start that each child should have a lot of opportunities for reinforcement should be your main takeaway. Okay, so we should remember to think about revisiting previous reinforcement strategies. So there's a couple of examples listed here on this page. And so, for example, if a child had previously used a token board, we may need to reintroduce that when we return to school buildings. Along the lines of a token board, if they had been working for 10 tokens, we may be going back to 5 tokens at a time. If we are just introducing a token board to a child, we may need to go back to a first then board. So first you do this and then you earn your reinforcer. We really need to, again, err on the side of reinforcing too much just to prevent those problem behaviors. Okay, so we are going to talk about non-contingent reinforcement. Okay, so non-contingent reinforcement is essentially we are reinforcing on a schedule, and we're turning off the need to engage in a behavior so the student we're going to give the student what they access the behavior for. So a good example of non-contingent reinforcement would be if a student vocalizes loudly during class, and we take data and we determine that the primary reason he is vocalizing loudly is to get attention from a teacher. So for example, if he's vocalizing and he is wanting attention, he may be getting negative attention from a teacher or paraeducator. And so he continues to engage in that loud vocalization. A good example of non-contingent reinforcement would be the teacher or paraeducator stopping by the student's desk and engaging with him briefly, giving him positive attention prior to him engaging in that loud vocalization. And this would be done on a schedule. And so we really want to set those schedules to an interval that is less than how often the child is engaging in that problem behavior. Okay, so this is a how-to on non-contingent reinforcement. And so first, you want to select a reinforcer that serves the same function as the problem behavior. So for example, again, if the function of the behavior is to gain attention from the teacher should provide the student with access to attention. So in this example, your reinforcer would be positive attention from an adult. Next, you're going to determine how often you will provide the reinforcer. So you are going to take data to determine the shortest period of time the student will engage in an activity before demonstrating the challenging behavior. And you're going to set that interval of reinforcement slightly below that time. So if your data is showing that a child engages in those loud vocalizations every 3 minutes, you would set your interval less than 3 minutes. So you are giving the child positive attention prior to them engaging in a behavior. You're going to use your schedule of reinforcement, and you're going to deliver reinforcement at the end of each interval throughout the duration of an activity. During implementation, you are going to ignore challenging behaviors. So if you're implementing non-contingent reinforcement and the child begins to engage in loud vocalizations, you are going to ignore that. As the challenging behaviors continue to decrease, you're going to gradually increase the time between each interval. Okay, so we have seen this slide before. Emily reviewed it, but if you are reinforcing, just remember the golden rule of pairing. You control the reinforcers. A child should not have free access to them. And so it just really is important to remember that rule there. Okay, so we are going to talk about demand fading. Okay, so demand fading, is when you slowly fade in demands to your instruction. So you've paired, you've got your reinforcement, then how do we get started with implementing demands and starting instruction? So there's a couple considerations here. So first, you would want to start with a motivating activity. So for example, you know that a student is motivated by playing with blocks or building with blocks. You may want to engage the child in that activity to start, and then you would slowly feed in an easy demand that has to do with that motivating activity. So if you're playing with blocks, you may say, stack the blocks up, or you may say, can you show me where the green block is? And so you're slowly fading in those easy demands that are still motivating for a child. And so this is a way to start fading in demands based on those motivating activities. There's a couple things to consider here. You may need to do this across the day. And so you may start the morning with little to no demands, and you're pairing, you're reinforcing for appropriate behavior. And as you get throughout the day, you may start to implement more demands. You can do this across sessions. So say you have a 30-minute small group session, you're working with a couple students. You may start the session in the beginning of that 30 minutes with little to no demands, and then slowly fade in more demands across that session. And you're going to continue to slowly increase those demands so that students continue to earn that reinforcement. While you're demand fading, if a student begins to exhibit problem behavior, we need to fade back our demands and again, introduce and increase reinforcement slowly. And so again, we're trying to eliminate or decrease those problem behaviors. And so this is one way to do that. you are going to, this is a good strategy for everyone, incorporate a classroom daily schedule from day one. So we are saying that when we go back to school, make sure you're pairing little limited demands, but even though we're doing that, you still want to make sure that you have your classroom schedule. So you want to run your groups when they're supposed to run. You want to run your small groups when they're supposed to run. Anything that is in your daily schedule, you should implement on day one, but just know that those areas of your schedule may have limited demands and you're practicing demand fading through each part of your schedule. And it should be said that staff should be delivering positive attention for identified students across an entire day. And so you can never give enough positive attention. And so just remember to continue to engage in that. Everyone in the classroom should be doing that. So catch a student being good, we always say. That is definitely something that there cannot be enough of when we go back to classrooms. Okay, so we have talked about pairing and reinforcement. And so what should we do now? We've paired ourselves with reinforcement and we should have students on a reinforcement schedule and we faded in demands. So now we need to determine what we need to teach. You should have a discussion with your classroom team. What's the first target that we want to teach? What supports can you put in place to ensure problem behaviors remain at low rates? We're going to go into a lot of different behavioral strategies later in this presentation, so that may help answer that question. But again, pairing, reinforcement, what we've talked about already are certainly good supports. And it's always important to remember that we should teach students how to access what they want appropriately rather than engage in problem behaviors. And so we are going to talk a little bit about functional communication training next. But first, we are going to go to the capture sheet.
So Lauren and company, I'm not able to access my video at the moment, but we have a big question that seems to be ongoing about edible reinforcement and social distancing and motor breaks, etc. Unless it's been established by your building administrator that you cannot use edible reinforcers, this is another circumstance where we need to think about doing things differently. So, for example, while we certainly don't want students grabbing food out of one another's hands, if we know that everybody wants that edible, we know that we have a really good reinforcer, not only for Lauren, but for Lisa and Emily who are trying to take it from her. So that's where we go to the point of looking at trying to keep student materials separate and distanced. We know that students are identifying reinforcers for us right at that time. Food is meant to be put in your mouth, so it's okay if Lauren wants to work for a pretzel and I give her a pretzel and she puts it in her mouth. What we do want to avoid, obviously, is then passing that pretzel around to our friends. So the concept of keeping kids separate, and please pardon my dogs in the background, we definitely will not be looking at community items. And you're right, Laura, you mentioned that students have been at home and they've been accessing things that they like a lot. Let's remember that we can still provide motor breaks. We have to rethink them. I'm going to see if my colleagues have something to add to that because I am having some dog background interference.
Yes, thank you, Chris. We can absolutely think about motor breaks. We have to think long and hard about the schedule, about the motor and the physical needs of the students within the classroom, and who's doing what, and whether it would be, whether we could do motor breaks. If there's a motor break room, that we could maintain distance with students within that room where they could maybe run around. One of the things that we looked at as we were trying to set up model classrooms in the fall was looking at those well-ventilated areas like the gym. Could we use them and have some equipment and stations within that gym area to use for students to get those motor breaks? Can we go and go out to the playground with 2 or 3 students for 5 or 10 minutes if it's not recess time, and use that, weather permitting? The good news is that we are coming out of winter and hopefully we will have more and more acceptable days in terms of outdoor activities. So there really is a way, if there is a will, there's a way we can think about this as your school team gets together and say, okay, how can we do this? What's feasible in terms of safety and staff? And looking at what opportunities you have in your building to look at the gym. Maybe there's a motor room that you can use. So there are all those options available. Also that Chris, I believe, mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation was we're going back first. But that's not to say that we can snatch every feasible room that might be available in the school, because we know some students are coming back within a couple of weeks. But it gives us time to kind of get the lay of the land and what is a reasonable, viable options in terms of room use in the building that we can use to provide those motor breaks and just scenery from the classroom, quite frankly. Our students are going to be eating in the classroom. So we do want to get the students up and moving, and our staff probably want to get up and moving and to see another room in the building every once in a while during the school day as well. So it is not on it's I believe this is very achievable. I think you have to go and talk to your team and say, how do we do this, and come up with certain scenarios and plans. Lisa or Lauren, I don't know whether you have anything to add to that.
No, I do not, about that specific point.
Okay.
I was going to move to, there's another question that says, how much demand should we be putting on wearing and keeping masks on during the first few weeks? I know many students will need to practice this, and I want to set up classroom expectations, but don't want to cause behaviors and too many demands early on.
Great
So,
question, actually.
Yeah, it's a really good question.
Great question.
I think one strategy you can use for this, and Lisa or Emily, please feel free, is implementing the mask with a motivating activity to start if you know that that's going to cause behaviors. So for example, I know many of our classrooms have been practicing mask wearing during motivating videos. A lot of people have started in that way, that students have to at least touch the mask to their face if that's where they are, or wear a mask during a video. If it's not a video, it could be another motivating item. So while they're playing with trains, I'm going back to, because that was the example in the video, they may have to engage in wearing the mask. I think mask wearing is certainly going to be an individualized decision. Some of our students are not going to be able to wear a mask at all, and we have to just practice them putting it up to their face. Some of our students can wear a mask all day. It really is going to be individualized, but I think getting started, if you know it's going to cause problem behaviors, pairing that mask wearing with a motivating activity may be a good strategy.
And really what Lauren is illustrating there is the section that I just did on pairing. So we are pairing ourselves with all those fun, motivating items for students. And we can use then that same principle to pair other things with those fun, motivating activities. So don't think about it happening in a vacuum. Pairing can happen. We can pair less preferred activities, more highly preferred activities to build up skills. So and increase that skill set for any student. So thank you, Lauren.
The only thing I would also add to that is if you think about our students who might not be tolerating a mask, wearing a mask right now, even though we've been practicing since September, we might just continue, we're going to continue to practice, but we're not going to expect it to happen in 24 hours. And so we know what the reality is, and we're going to just keep on trying to pair ourselves with reinforcement, pair the mask with reinforcement, and then reinforce the student for even just tolerating it, bringing it up to their face, or tolerating it to have around one ear, or, or holding it a little bit tighter around their face. Just those little baby steps and reinforcing that time while we're pairing it with watching a favorite video and things like that. So it will take time for our students to learn how to wear a mask. It's going to take time for our students to learn how to social distance, and knowing that and kind of recognizing that and saying, okay, I know this is not going to happen overnight. My team knows it's not going to happen overnight. And what can we do? Let's celebrate those little steps. What can we do to work towards our end goal?
And again, just getting back to some of the questions or comments, whether it's reinforcement and pairing, and they're both kind of interwoven and they're interlinked, we are not going to be stingy. We're not going to say because it's a community toy, well, he can't have it. If he really wants that community toy, we're not going to be sharing community toys or games anymore. So if you have one student who just loves that game, we probably need to make the decision that while we're going through that pairing process, he's the only one that has access to that game. And again, these are individual team decisions. And we have to kind of weigh and balance it out. But because the rule was before that nobody could get it unless everybody was engaging in a game, that rule's out the window. And if there is a student who really loves that game, we can achieve some pairing and establish that willing learner, then we need to use it.
Emily, I didn't catch the last part of what you said.
I was just saying that sometimes I saw a comment that if it's a community game that everybody plays with, and the student can't have it. If the student really, if there's one student in the class that really enjoys that game that every student used to play with, we need to be thinking about just making sure that that student has access to that game, because we're not going to be teaching turn-taking games right now anyway. And so those kind of preconceived rules of what we did before, we really have to rethink them. I would actually advocate that we should be using that game even if we didn't have social distancing and COVID. That particular student, if we're so drawn to that game in terms of a pairing procedure for a particular student. Does that make sense, Lisa?
Yes, I missed what you said at the end.
Okay.
Your audio went up.
Okay.
Absolutely. And while we don't want to share materials, we can be creative to make materials or reinforcers that are solely for that child. I think that's what you were alluding to, Emily. So in one of the classrooms I was in was it just yesterday, we had different colored tape, and we were putting, just a little teeny piece of tape on specific materials or reinforcers that we would know that each child was a different color, so to speak. And so that would be a visual cue for staff to remember that this student is going to be using this item as a reinforcer or as a working material, and it wouldn't be shared with anybody else. So I think if you kind of start thinking about how can we identify specific things for specific students, whether it's putting it in a bin or a box or a drawer of some sort, for this child, because we know this student particularly loves this game or this toy, and that could be used just for that student.
There's some additional people typing right now, so I think maybe we can move to the next section and go back if there's more questions.
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to talk about functional communication training. When we think about children or students who engage in problem behaviors, typically they're trying to tell us something. They could be communicating that they don't want to do something, or that they're frustrated, that they want attention, or they want an item, they want a tangible, they're not happy you took something away from them. Typically, behavior is a form of communication. And so really when we're thinking about our students that are in ALO programs or special schools, we're not just really working on teaching the curriculum, we also have to think about teaching them those functional life skills. And communication training is huge for a lot of our students. Many of our students don't have language to let you know what they're thinking or feeling. And so really we want to create a system that each student can use to let us know what they want. And we do this by either using sign or pictures. If the student is verbal, having them use spoken language, and creating that system and then teaching that system throughout the school day. It's really important that we just don't say, I teach functional communication training during snack time, or what used to be snack time. We probably won't have snack time necessarily in class as a whole group. But that's when I train, that's when I teach communication. Communication should be taught throughout the school day. Over the next 3 pages, you'll see just a step-by-step plan on how to teach communication to students. The first step really is to identify an interfering behavior that we can use or replace with functional communication. So for example, if a student, every time the student is presented with an unwanted, undesired task, a task that might be too challenging or a non-preferred task, the child will engage in some form of behavior, running out of their seat, aggression, throwing the item, whatever the behavior might be. We then need to determine the function of that behavior. I'm going to say it's for escape, and choose a replacement behavior. I'm going to have the student ask for a break. And so teaching the student to ask for a break instead of getting out of his chair, instead of hitting or aggressing towards a staff member, instead of throwing the paper off the desk, by hitting a button or pulling off a picture or tapping a picture or signing the word for break, or saying the word break. That is a easy replacement behavior. And the goal is to make sure that the communication that you're training, that you're teaching, takes very little effort and a lot less effort than the behavior that the student was engaging. So by touching a button or touching a picture or signing break is a lot less effort than running out of away from my desk, or trying to destroy property, or hitting a staff member. There's really little effort to do this, to make that sign for break or to hand that picture. And that's where we want to start. As the student becomes more competent and confident in their communication, as they've mastered more and more communication skills, then you can look at increasing their sentence length. You can start to increase, the demands that they have to do in between asking for a break. One of the things that we often find is that our students can learn to ask for a break rather quickly. They might learn it in a day because we're going to honor it every time they ask for it. And the way that we would teach this is right before they start to engage in that behavior. If we see a little bit of that anxiety, a little bit of that irritation from the student, we're going to automatically have them, whether it's a model prompt or a model prompt or a gestural prompt or even a verbal prompt, we're going to have them ask for a break. We're going to show them, here, just touch this picture, just touch this button, just say break, just do this sign. And then we say, sure, let's take a break, and we go for a break. The more we practice this, the more they're going to understand, wait, all I have to do is ask for a break, and I don't have to do this task. And it's going to happen pretty quickly, usually. And then once the student understands that this is a very effective way of communicating rather than engaging in those behaviors, you're going to start to slowly to fade in those demands. So the student will ask for a break, and you say, sure, let's first do one thing. Sure, first clap your hands, and then let's go for a break. Or sure, let's do this one math problem, and let's go for a break. And so you're going to slowly fade in those demands. Next slide, please. You want to make sure that you are reinforcing that communication behavior throughout the day. So asking for a break doesn't just happen during math group. Asking for a break can happen during morning meeting or circle time. It could happen during reading. It could happen during community-based instruction, even if we're doing it in the classroom or in the school. Anytime that you see the student might be getting a little bit irritated before they reach that level of that problem behavior, you want to introduce, or you want to teach them to ask for a break, so they really understand that they can ask for a break at any time. It's not just during this one particular session, or not just with this one particular staff member. And then certainly as time goes on, as the student learns that I can ask for break throughout, you can shape that communication behavior to add more words. I want break to, or want break, and you can do the sign, or break please if you know the please and thank yous are important to you. But you really want to make sure you're practicing it throughout the school day. This also includes asking for things that they want. So we talked a little bit about food earlier, but if a student is hungry, or if they need a way to tell you, I want something to eat. A lot of times we take communication books away for students during instruction. If those are their words, if that's their voice, they need to have access to their communication book at all times. And so they need to know where it is. You might say we're going to put it in your desk, but they need to be able to have access. And again, just like with teaching them to ask for a break, if they're asking for something that they want, they're asking for candy and they ask for candy 700 times in a day, you can start to fade in those demands to say, sure, first we're going to work and then you can get candy. You can start using a token system. Excuse me. You can start creating a situation or the environment, and so that they're not always getting it immediately, but there's some delayed gratification. Next slide. Certainly data is important to make sure that we're going in the right direction. And here we have 2 videos to show you. Hopefully the sound will work.
What do you want to eat? Cereal.
So in this video, he pushed the button eat, and the teacher then asked, what do you want to eat? And then he pushed the button cereal. So very little effort to get what he wants. He had already learned where cereal was, and we were trying to build in a second word. So he had learned, I asked for cereal, I get cereal. And every time he asked for cereal, he got cereal. Now we're teaching him to do eat cereal, and we were doing a forward chain. Okay. There's no sounds.
This might be hard to narrate through, Lisa, so we may just have to skip it. Hopefully people who've downloaded the PowerPoint, the links are in there. So hopefully they'll work on their home computers when they
Right.
press those links. So
Okay. And I will just share, in the video, she had the student asking for a game that he particularly loved, but he was pretty self-sufficient. If you read the captions before, he usually got things himself. And she really wanted to get him to communicate with her and engage in some communication with somebody else instead of just communication in general. And so he had to ask for the lid of the popcorn machine. He had to ask for the cup. He told her what he wanted and what he needed and what she needed to do. And so it was just a nice back and forth of really building on, in the beginning, I would imagine that they started with turn on or on, and she would turn on and the popcorn would fly out of the machine. And that was all he needed to do. And slowly she has increased the amount of language that he needed to use in order to get the end result of watching the popcorn fly out of the machine. So if you have time to look at that video, it is a nice way of just seeing how she is really pulling more and more language out of this student. Okay, I think that's it. Next slide. I believe we're going to the capture sheet.
So there was one question in there about thanking us for the videos, but the concern is that students are coming back after being home a year, and all the potential issues that staff may encounter. And so one of the reasons why we talked about certainly functional communication has to be happening all the time. We cannot say, okay, we've given them one opportunity to ask for their favorite thing. We're done for the day with functional communication training. It has to happen all day long, contriving lots of communicative opportunities for our students. But remember, even though we're doing capture sheets by section, everything that we're presenting, all the practice and the principles that we're presenting are all interwoven. So we're not just going to do pairing and we're going to say, oh, we're done with pairing now, let's get to non-contingent reinforcement and let's get demand fading and functional communication training. All of this is happening at the same time. And one of the reasons why we decided to discuss pairing first, it's usually the first thing that we do when we don't know a student that well, and we are saying that we don't know our students that well anymore after them being home for a year, even though we've seen them on the screen every day. We don't know how they're going to really respond coming into the school building. That's why we're doing the pairing. That's why we're saying it's so important. It was always important. Now it becomes critically, doubly, I don't know how many superlatives to use, important, that we do that pairing, so that if people are a little bit worried about who they're going to encounter on March 1st and getting off that bus, we have a plan in place. Again, we are going to be the giver of all good things, and as Forrest Gump would say, life is going to be like a box of chocolates. Okay.
And yes, and I want to mention, there's a lot of talk about wiping things down, and certainly we want to keep things as clean as possible with very little cross-contamination as possible. But I think it's important if we just practice good hand hygiene, and health and good practices. I was working with the school team yesterday and we were talking about, as the students enter the classroom, having hand sanitizer. So as they walk in, everybody who walks into that class, they're coming in with clean hands. So anything that is touched within the classroom, their hands are at least sanitized coming in. We're going to do everything that we can to make sure that students don't touch multiple, each other's materials. But if a student has a PEX book or a communication device and they're touching it, I don't think it needs to be wiped down every time they touch it. Maybe it gets wiped down at the end of the day, but it is their communication book. It's not being used by other students. And so that student using their communication book, they're touching it. And as long as staff are continuously using good hand hygiene, washing their hands or using hand sanitizer, there should not be, it should be okay for the student to have a communication book.
It has to be okay for students to have a communication book. They have a right to communicate. It is a human right, and so we just need to be careful. There's going to be gallons of hand sanitizer in every classroom, but we want to make sure that students have their communication systems with them at all times. Again, if we're doing one or two of these practices and we're not doing one piece of it, we are not only doing what we should be doing, what we're obligated to do for the student. Remember, all decisions are going to be student-centered, but we're probably making our lives much more difficult as well. But the first consideration has to be the student. The student has to be able to communicate.
And again, I do think that while our goal is to remain our goal is for that social distance and mask wearing, the reality is many of our students in our discrete programs and special schools are still going to need to work on what that social distance is. And we are going to need to use proximity and be a little bit closer to our students than that social distance piece, which is why we have that additional PPE. Okay, so next section. Oh, we're going to take a quick break. So it's 5:34. Let's come back at 5:45. Okay.
Sounds good.
Okay, so I think we're going to get back and start again. So now we're going to talk about specific interfering behaviors. We're going to talk a little bit about proactive strategies that can be used, as well as responsive strategies for when the behaviors do occur. And our first behavior that we're going to talk about is mask wearing, or students who will not wear a mask. And so when we think about students who, we know that our students, some of our students, no matter how much we've been working on it since September, really are still not able to tolerate wearing a mask for a short period of time, or longer periods of time. And so proactively, we're going to continue to we're going to look at preferential seating. We're going to look at where we've put the student, making sure that the student really isn't facing other children or their peers. We're going to pair the most valuable reinforcers with mask wearing. So if they love watching a specific video, they get to watch that video as long as they have their mask on. Really just kind of working on slowly building that tolerance level. We might look at differential reinforcement for mask wearing. While we don't have plexiglass barriers in the schools, you might have a divider or some other environmental thing that you can use to help limit any kind of droplets that are coming from the student's mouth to be going into the air. You're really looking at where you place that student in the classroom. And our goal, of course, is to continue to work on the student wearing the mask and tolerating the mask. We might also look at alternatives to just a regular mask by having the student wear a neck gaiter or a bandana, or possibly a face shield. Responsive strategies would be, again, ongoing instruction, training, and environmental barriers. But we really are not able to discipline a student or not allow a student to come to school because they're not able to tolerate a mask. We have students for health reasons that they're not able to wear a mask because of breathing issues. We have students who for sensory, who have sensory needs that are not able to wear a mask or are not yet able to tolerate a mask. And so really just kind of working on desensitizing the student to and getting them to and teaching them how to wear a mask. Next slide. We do have a lot of students in our special programs, in our discrete programs and special schools that mouth objects. They are still exploring their environment through mouthing different items. And this is something that pre-COVID was very challenging to stop and limit with our students. So just thinking about things that proactively, if I know I have a student who does mouth things, maybe having a bin of items that the student can mouth that is just for them, and every day we'll sterilize and clean that bin for the next day. Making sure that that we're frequently washing a student's hands, or we're using hand sanitizer, that we're making sure that the materials that are touched or mouthed are put in a place that we'll wash or sanitize later. Maybe instead of using multiple materials, we go into a chewy or a jewelry, a chewy necklace, or a chewy bracelet, or a traditional chewy that is, on a lanyard or on a necklace of some sort. And of course, we need to think about the extra saliva that sometimes those chewies do produce. And so if their clothing is going to get wet, maybe we ask parents for extra sets of clothing so that we can change the student's clothing if need be. And then staff would wear that appropriate PPE as a proactive strategy. So maybe with this student, when you're working with this student, you are wearing gloves or you are wearing the gowns in order to protect yourself from the bodily fluids that occur during mouthing. Responsive strategies. This should not be a power struggle. We do know that for some students, it really is a need, and it's not something that they're going to learn how to not do immediately. And typically, one behavior is replaced by another behavior. So we really need to look at the function of what mouthing objects, what is that doing for the student? Is it truly a sensory need? Do they need to chew on something? Do they need to have something in their mouth? What is it that what is the function of that behavior, and what can we replace it with that is a little bit more sanitary if possible? Next slide. Continuing with bodily fluids, spitting. If you have a student who spits or engages in saliva play, proactive strategies might be to teach the student to wear a face shield. Maybe the student, instead of playing with saliva, we have a water bin that he can play with, so it's still liquid, but it's in a bin. Using differential reinforcement, so praising the student for having a dry mouth, praising the student for having dry hands, depending on what part of the spitting or saliva play is he seeking. Is it the wet hands, or is it the wet mouth? And then looking at, of course, where the student is sitting as well. Again, looking at what PPE staff will be wearing. And if you have a student who's certainly spitting at others, the face screen or face shield, gloves, possibly a room divider, and you're just going to kind of block and redirect the student to face forward or to face another direction so that you limit that spitting contact. Next slide. Students who yell or make loud noises. Again, when we're looking at this, we're really thinking about any particles that could be coming from the mouth when you're yelling, or when you're engaging in producing loud voices or loud noises. Again, using non-contingent reinforcement. I love the way you have a quiet mouth. Reinforce. Having the student wear some headphones might help. Replacing, giving the student a chewy or something that will limit the amount of time that they would yell. Planned ignoring is a very effective behavioral strategy if the student is engaging in these behaviors for attention. Again, thinking about what the function of that behavior is, but if they're yelling for your attention, ignoring that is going to decrease it much faster than giving them attention for that behavior. differential reinforcements, preferential seating, face shield for the student, again, and then hopefully if the student is wearing a mask, he can yell and make noises all he wants because everything is staying within the context of that mask. Responsive strategies, again, staff to wear appropriate PPE, visual cues to redirect the student and possibly a room divider. Next slide. Self-stimulatory behaviors. So really when we think about self-stimulatory behaviors, we need to kind of think how much of it is interfering with student learning. And at this time, if a student is engaging in hand flapping or rocking, you know, their eyes are in the corner of their pupils are in the, you know, they're looking in the corner of their eyes and they're looking at a specific toy, or they like to play with string or flick a straw back and forth. Whatever that self-stimulatory behavior is it a need that we need to decrease now? Is it something that we can allow the student to do because it's not engaging in, there's no harm coming to anybody. There is no bodily fluids if the self-stimulatory behavior is more movement rather than something, you know, something that does include bodily fluids, but really allowing that behavior to happen. As we get acclimated back into the classroom, we can start working on decreasing those self-stimulatory behaviors later. Once we've paired with reinforcement, once we've got, you know, demands going on in the classroom, once we've got a communication system established, we can look at decreasing those self-stimulatory behaviors, especially if they're not doing any harm. But you can still reinforce. I love how you're keeping your body still. Nice job keeping your hands, hands down. You could include scheduled motor breaks, so allowing that child to get up and move, especially for our students who rock or need that movement. Providing appropriate sensory items during non-contingent reinforcements. And then your responsive strategies, again, I would allow it to happen as long as that it's not including bodily fluids. If there is some spitting or loud vocalizations as a self-stimulatory behavior, I would also allow, if not dangerous, and then use your PPE and block with dividers if necessary. Next slide. So out of seat is something very common in a lot of our classrooms. It typically serves the function of escape. I really don't want to do this. Sometimes there's a little bit of attention seeking, come chase me. And, you know, when we think about that functional communication training, this really ties into how we would teach a replacement behavior of out of seat. So we would say you would ask for a break, or you would ask to get up and go for a walk or things like that. Proactive strategies, again, frequent movement breaks. If you know your student can sit for about 10 minutes before they need to get out of their chair and move, then in 8 minutes, I would have them ask for a break and get up and walk. You're practicing functional communication training every 8 minutes throughout the school day. That's a lot of practice. And then you're also controlling their behavior in the fact that you're providing what their body needs. You're providing that movement proactively. You're having them ask for it. You're granting it. You're doing a quick walk around the classroom or a quick, jumping jacks in the corner or whatever kind of movement that they need. And then we go back and sit down and we get another 8 minutes out of work. If you think about the alternative, we push to 10 minutes. The student gets up. It becomes a chasing game. We're maybe out for 5 or 6 or 10 minutes, sometimes 15 minutes. The student now comes back. They think it's hilarious. And we've kind of switched the control of that situation from staff to students. So we really want to think of those proactive strategies. Reinforcing the student for sitting in their chair. You could look at alternate seating, either one of those seat cushions, a rocking chair, a yoga ball, those TheraBands that you could put at the bottom of their chair to keep their feet busy, things like that. Responsive strategies. Again, we talked about functional communication training, redirecting the student back to seat, use of the PROMIS procedure if needed. For those of you who don't know what a PROMIS procedure is basically rewarding the student with something that they like, once the transition has been completed. So I might promise the student and show them like, here, see the toy car? Let's take the car with you over to the work table. Or I might say, let's go over to the work table, and then they get the car once they've completed that transition. I just caution for those staff who do use a promise procedure on a regular basis to know your students. Typically, if the child does engage in problem behaviors during that transition, the promise goes away. This might increase or escalate a problem behavior, which is not our goal at this time. So I caution that if you're going to use a promise procedure, really know your students and make sure that you have a plan if the transition does not work and the promise needs to go away. And there is a resource, I believe, that walks you through what a promise procedure looks like. Next slide. So this is a big topic, I think, on everybody's mind, is the elopement piece. We do have students who will try and get out of the classroom, that will try and get out of the building. We need to kind of look at, again, the function. What are they doing? What is the end goal? For some of our students, we know they're running to the soda machine, or they're running to another classroom to see a teacher, or they saw a toy, or they saw a favorite book in another classroom and they're running to that classroom. And so it's important, again, to think about what are those proactive strategies. Functional communication training. Could they ask to go see the soda machine? Could they ask to go to Miss Stanley's classroom to get the book that they like, or to see the book, or to see the person? So really working on that proactively. You want to make sure you're giving frequent movement breaks to allow for that movement. And you definitely want to use proximity. If you know that you have a student who is going to engage in elopement, who is going to run, you really want to stay close. Even in this time of social distancing, that's why we have that extra PPE, but safety is our #1 priority. And then, of course, reinforcing our students for staying with the class or staying in the designated area. If you do have a student who gets out of the classroom, staff should have eyes on the student at all times. Staff should contact the front office, or have a plan if you have a student who frequently elopes. And then if the student does leave the building, you should, or leave school grounds, you should call 911 immediately.
Lisa, can I interject here from the dark?
Sure.
I do want to let everyone know that we've had lots of questions about elopement in this time. And elopement in this time is no more or less serious than it was before COVID. Someone asked, what happens if a student leaves our cohort and runs into another cohort and takes their mask off? And your response will be no different. And your caution about COVID will be no different. And I want to reassure you that, the data are there, that in terms of exposing anyone to COVID, we want to remember a couple things. One is that our students do not necessarily have COVID. We're going to act like everyone has COVID until we know that it's safe to do otherwise. But I think it will help us all breathe if we remember that not everyone has COVID. We're going to put all those strategies in place to protect ourselves and others, but it's not likely to hurt someone if a student leaves our cohort, takes off their mask, and goes yelling into another cohort. Elopement is a serious behavior. We should look at all those proactive reinforcement strategies. Worst comes to worst, make it look like it was our idea that they leave the classroom and they're just coming along for the ride with us when we join them. But if you can rewire your thinking to say it's a serious challenge, it's no more serious than it was before. And we're going to get next to those strategies for moving students from areas from which they don't want to be moved. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Next slide. Okay. So I think we're going to take a quick break and look at that capture sheet, and then we'll talk more about other behaviors.
So there was one question regarding alternate assessment testing, and if we're coming back to school and we are establishing those pairing procedures and all those other good procedures we've talked about so far. How do we start making those demands of alternate testing? So I think the window is rather large or wide, I should say. So we really need to look at the window. We don't want to put ourselves in a position where we're not giving ourselves enough time to get the testing done. I do think there are going to be some students who are going to come back, and after we do some pairing that does not take so long for 1 or 2 students, we can start when it's appropriate. And again, a team decision. If we can start some of that testing, we absolutely should. We don't want to leave 6 students tested until the very end of the window, because you're going to get yourselves in a bit of a pickle. I know that was not related to anything we discussed, but it was an important question. Thank you for raising it. And certainly, if you have other questions, to talk to your support staff, the special ed team, if you're SCB, or if you're extensions or autism, to talk to your program specialist about that.
I wanted to talk about, because I feel like it's repeating over and over, that people are asking if there is face shields for students. Since we're listing that a lot in the slides, it came up in a couple sections. And so there has been face shields ordered. Somebody wrote as the answer, I think it was Chris, wrote in there that there's so much coming into the schools right now that sometimes admin may not even be aware of what is actually coming into schools. So please ask your administration, and if they are unaware of the face shields, ask them to contact the Department of Materials Management, because we do have student face shields available.
Students may tolerate a face shield more than a mask. I'm of the opinion that probably masks are less
Intrusive.
Intrusive, thank you. Less intrusive than a face mask. I think could be, again, it will depend on the student. And in terms of just kind of more of a socially significant skill in terms of face masks, again, I'm hearing from different TV pundits that this is not going to be our first pandemic. And so we as a society have to get used to wearing face masks even after, hopefully, we've eradicated COVID. It sounds like there might be some more pandemics coming down the road. Hopefully not. But I do think when we think about what is a socially significant skill to teach our students, obviously all those very necessary self-care skills, functional communication. I think mask wearing now becomes part of those very necessary self-care skills that we've got to teach. And it becomes a much more socially significant skill in the community than a face shield. That's not to say that we wouldn't have students use face shields sometimes also, but to me, a mask would be the top priority. And if a student can't tolerate a mask, but will tolerate a face shield, then we need to go with that. Again, these are team decisions based on your student needs. So, any other questions there, Lauren, that we need to talk about?
No, we've answered most of the questions that were on that sheet there. I think all of the other questions we've answered.
Okay, so
I do want to say a word, Emily, about Chewies.
Uh-huh.
Chewies come back in that category of, if our kids are really motivated to have a Chewy, if they need to have a Chewy, if we found that Chewies are acceptable alternatives to chewing on other things, we can let the kids have their Chewies. It's the same as that pretzel concept we talked about before. Don't let the other kids share the Chewy, which you never did in the first place. We're going to have to try extra hard to keep those materials separated. They can be washed with soap and water. You're perfectly safe handling a Chewy with your gloves on. So Chewies, again, if we take Chewies away from all our students, they're all probably going to elope. So let's think hard about the new way of handling a Chewy, but Chewies are okay. Let's just keep them from being shared.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so I'm on next, and so I think there's about 7 or 8 slides, and we'll have another capture sheet. But it's in terms of you now see the format of our slides; they're pretty similar. So we're going to talk about. You all have access to the slides, so we have about 5 or 6 behaviors we're going to talk about. But before we start talking about the actual behavior, remember what we talked about in terms of pairing.
And we also have to make sure that we have those functional reinforcers for students, that we have students on reinforcement schedules that we know work. And we're reinforcing, we're always looking to catch the student being good and reinforcing those good behaviors. And again, not an exhaustive list, following directions, staying in your seat, walking in the hallway nicely. If the student engages in a lot of vocalizations, a quiet mouth. All of those proactive, salient behaviors to working and following directions and being in the classroom, we want to make sure that we're catching that all the time and we're reinforcing. And then we're also going to, as we talk through the next few slides and behaviors, we're going to be looking at those incompatible behaviors we're going to reinforce. And for many of our students, because we will be talking about tantrum behavior, self-injury, and aggression. Hopefully we have done functional behavior assessment on those students if they were engaging in those behaviors before the shutdown, that we have, even though the data are old, hopefully some of it are still pertinent, and we can look at those behavior plans and again, make sure that we are following those behavior plans with fidelity in terms of that particular student. So let's talk about body dropping. I think I saw a question in the chat about body dropping. So proactive strategies. And again, think of behavior plan, think of functional behavior assessment. Think the question should be to all of these behaviors, and the behaviors that Lisa talked about is, why are they doing this? If we know the answer to why, we're probably 80% there. Then we can figure out how then we reduce that behavior by building up those alternative, shaping up more alternative incompatible behaviors and that functional communication training. Okay, so for body dropping, we're going to limit transitions. But you know what, if we know that a child doesn't engage in transitions when they go to the motor room, because they know they're going to the motor room, guess what? As they're transitioning to the motor room, we're going to catch them being good, and we're going to give them lots of reinforcement as they're going to the motor room. You may say, Emily, but the ultimate payoff is the motor room. I know that, but again, we want to catch them being good in that behavior of transitioning nicely. But for some students, we will limit those transitions. We're going to provide lots of non-contingent reinforcement. And again, why is the student doing this? It may be to get out of a task, it may be to get a lot of attention. We might be saying, don't do that. Why do you do that? You know I don't like it when you do that. You need to get up, get up, get up, get up, get up. So we're going to be front-loading students with lots of that non-contingent attention. So we're reducing the need or the motivation to get that attention with more negative behaviors. We might engage in planned ignoring. So if a student drops to the ground, we might just every once in a while give them the cue to get up without giving them any eye contact, but we might just wait them out and ignore them. And that means if another adult passes that child, you and the child in the hallway, we're not going to talk about it. The other adult isn't going to say, "You need help? Is he doing this again?" Remember, planned ignoring. Increasing wait time is part of that. With all of our students, we're going to simplify those language demands. We might provide some first then warnings, those visual first then cues. First we're going to walk down the hallway, then this is going to happen. And again, that differential reinforcement. We are going to make sure we're catching the student being good. We might have a schedule of where we're doing that. So again, we are reducing the need or the motivation for the student to engage in that problem behavior. And again, responsive strategies. Again, if the student is in a sit-down strike, we're just going to provide that check-in with it. Every once in a while, we're going to say, you need to stand up. Again, we're not going to give them eye contact when we're doing that. We're going to keep eyes on, but not give eye contact. This is actually a behavior where you can maintain that social distance. And we're going to just make sure that we have eyes on and we're visually monitoring at all times. Next slide, please. So compulsive behaviors. So when I think of compulsive behaviors for our students, it can really mean repetitive behaviors. So let's say flicking a pencil over and over again, or it can be that compulsive behavior, like I have to push my chair in and out of my desk 5 times. Okay, a lot of these behaviors are internally driven. Those more repetitive behaviors, like flicking a pencil repetitively, is more intrinsically reinforced. The student is usually providing their own reinforcement. For those compulsive repetitive behaviors, we really have to ask the question, how stigmatizing is it? How disruptive is it? And if they are low-level behaviors, we need to be able to allow them and not really worry about them too much. Or if the first bullet here has controlled access to compulsion, so we might even let the student earn that compulsion if he has to press, 5 stickers on a paper or something like that. We will also use that kind of planned ignoring that we talked about. And then we really need to think of the room setup. Is the student engaging in the room because, or in the room, sorry, excuse me, in the behavior because there's some loud noises always go off in one side of the room? Do we need to think about if we can environmentally block that for the student? If nothing else, just moving the student further away from that noise that we don't have much control over, noise that is. And then if we need to, we can block if the student keeps on lunging or is impulsive towards a light switch. We need to think about blocking with dividers. Again, this is a team decision. The team needs to talk about this and to determine what is the safest course of action for these behaviors. Next slide, please. So rigidity kind of goes hand in hand with compulsions or OCD and that repetitive behavior. In a way, the child kind of gets stuck on something, whether it's a topic or a task. And so for our students who have a little bit more language and can understand a little bit more of that language mediated instruction, we can do things like adapt the Unstuck and On Target curriculum for them and tailor it to his or hers language level and learner level. We can also tap into the expertise of our OTs, who a lot of them know zones of regulation. And we can do adapted lessons for zones of regulation for all of our kiddos. But again, we need to be thinking about schedules of reinforcement. Do you see a trend here? There isn't that much difference between those proactive or those antecedent strategies. And again, the responsive strategy would be allow if it's not dangerous. Don't get into power struggles. It's okay. Think about the training you took on that de-escalation. Next slide, please. Attention-seeking behaviors. So those are for students who are want a lot of eye contact from you and maybe engaging in behaviors to even receive attention-seeking behaviors can be to get that fun attention from you or to get those reprimands. And a lot of times people will say, well, I reprimand him, so he knows not to do it. Well, that reprimand, even though you may think it's somewhat punitive, is not necessarily punitive, right? So we really need to think of attention-seeking behaviors and how we mitigate it from the get-go, those proactive antecedent strategies. Now, remember, anything we're saying here is not happening in a void. They're all interlinked. Everything needs to be happening at the same time. And Lauren earlier on talked about non-contingent reinforcement. So with non-contingent reinforcement, we're really front-loading the student with that attention. So again, he or she is getting so much attention that we have abolished all motivation for him to get that attention because we're given to him for free. And we're giving it to him all the time based on a schedule that we have determined as a team. Really, really important. Next slide, please. So again, the next few slides I think are about aggression, self-injurious behavior, and tantrum behavior. Topographically, they all kind of look different, but they're all potentially dangerous behaviors. We know this. And again, remember, we're doing functional and behavior assessment. We're asking the question why. We have done all of our pairing. We have identified really good reinforcers for the student. We're giving them all that attention. And the other piece that is really important is the piece that Lisa reviewed on functional communication training. So if a child is engaging in aggression to escape a task or to get something that they want, because that aggression has always gotten them that, they've been able to escape with that aggression, or they've been able to get something they want when they engage in aggression. As Lisa said, we need to change and shift that paradigm. And by our non-contingent attention, but especially by our functional communication training, we are really going to replace that behavior with much more appropriate forms of communication to get what they want. And we're going to make it easier. So if a child engages in aggression to get a break, we are just going to make the behavior of asking for a break so much more easier and simpler than engaging in aggression. And we're going to give them lots of opportunities to practice so that they can really learn that skill. We can shape up that skill and thereby reduce aggression. But the other pieces that you also want to consider is your environmental considerations, spacing between student and staff. I mean, we're going to make sure that that's happening now as when we return. That non-contingent reinforcement piece, visual cues to remind of appropriate behavior. It's really important to think about this happening before the behavior occurs. If the behavior starts occurring and the child is engaging in aggression, that is not the time we're going to whip out all these PCFs of hands down and quiet. The time for that is gone, but we can do it proactively or in an antecedent way. Again, differential reinforcement for those appropriate incompatible behaviors and limit demands that trigger the behavior. Again, remember, we're going to be airing and slowly fading in demands. And those the responsive strategies. If we have to engage in CPI, we have to engage in CPI. That is a team decision. Obviously, that should be always pre-COVID, during COVID, when we go back to school. That should always be the action of last resort. And the other points there, bullets there, are pretty self-explanatory. Okay, next one, please. So again, self-injurious behavior, the same question as why. Why is he or she doing that? Hopefully we have the answer from our data, and we will be taking some updated data as students return. And again, think about functional communication training and front loading with all that non-contingent reinforcement and all those pairing strategies. Again, that needs to be ongoing all the time. But those proactive strategies we need to consider is the non-contingent reinforcement, redirecting the student. We might, if the SIB is really dangerous or very intense, then we as a group need to think about other ways to protect that student. Certainly, again, we have to be implementing the behavior intervention plan with fidelity, that functional communication training. And then the other pieces is that we always do need to make sure that we're ruling out that health piece. It's really important, though, even though we need to rule out the health piece, we don't want to get into any mentalistic thinking like he's doing that because he has autism, or he's doing that kind of circular thinking of he's engaging in self-injurious behavior because he's angry, right? That does not help. That's not observable. But there are ways to determine why the student is engaging in that behavior. So we really have to let go of that mentalistic thinking. When we think about behavioral applied behavior analysis, we're talking about how that behavior has an impact on the environment and what the child is getting from that behavior. Okay. And there's a great resource there on functional communication on that slide. So when you go back and look at your slides, you should take a look at that. Next one. So again, you see, again, there's a little bit of a pattern here. You guys are all going to be stellar at non-contingent reinforcement. Those visual cues, that differential reinforcement, and then limiting demands that trigger that behavior. So it's really about that antecedent awareness. Do we have everything set in place and we're just not reacting to the behavior? Did we, you know, in terms of a fidelity checklist, were functional reinforcers, were we reinforcing incompatible behaviors or absence of that behavior? And were the reinforcers functional? In other words, did the child, are those reinforcers important to the child? Did we make sure that we are doing our functional communication training and we're asking for the child, or we're giving many opportunities across the day for the child to ask for a break if escaping the task is what is maintaining the behavior? They're engaging in this behavior because they don't want to do something. Are we looking at shaping up that behavior and making it very easy for that child to either ask for a break or ask for attention or ask for an item that they want? And again, the functional communication training, we have to make sure that the response we're teaching them to get those things is really easy. It's easier than engaging in the tantrum. Okay, I think that's my section done. So let's go over our capture sheet real quick.
So I know that a couple people are saying they're having trouble with the capture sheet or the Q&A here, just saying there's too much traffic on it.
I had to reload it. It says try again. And when I did that, I was able to get it. There's a little hint that says reload or try again. And I just
Yeah, I
that.
think when you posted the link again, it kind of knocked everybody out. So if they click on the link again, it should work.
So I'm having that issue right now as well. I'm reloading, but it's being really slow. So if Lisa or you, Emily or Chris can see the questions.
I can see the questions. It's just a little bit slow. Give me one moment. So not necessarily for this section, but maybe we have questions about edibles and students who may need edibles and a staff disagreement about whether or not edibles are important right now. This is where really those cheesy community norms come into play. In addition to the things we've talked about today, we've talked about those proactive strategies, and whoever wrote the question has good thinking about not having a power struggle about food right now. So I think it's important to agree with your team about food and how we can gradually reduce access to edibles as reinforcement if that's an important community norm. We have a question about a student who elopes, who's known to aggress, and the staff hasn't had the second CPI training, so that's a 7-part question. We're going to urge you to return to the question, why is the student doing this? What are they getting out of it? And what are our preventative strategies? Depending on why the student's trying to elope will really be something that you need to talk about with your team and whoever your behavioral supports are. The aggression may be a piece of the chain of elopement. It may be an attention-seeking part of its own. But here's where those proactive, making the student happy to be in the environment strategies come into play. There are multiple people who have not had the second CPI training, and I think this is as good a time as any to acknowledge that. Staff are working hard to get training out to our teens while acknowledging social distancing needs. But there is an effort to increase the rate of offering. We know that you need it. And when the two intersect, a challenging student who may elope and the fact that you haven't had your second CPI, that's something else to discuss in your team. I have not been CPI certified in several years, but if I come into your classroom and there's a student who's become aggressive and is eloping, I may be able to cover this other students in the classroom. Or you as the teacher may say, will you grab his bin? Or will you block him with a blocking pad? All of those things are things that someone who has not been CPI trained can do while they can't really put hands on student. And the last thing I want to say is if you are in a state of crisis and a student is about to seriously harm himself or others, what Montgomery County doesn't ask is, are you CPI certified? In that single critical instance, they ask, did you do something that's prudent to help prevent an injury to staff or students? So if worse comes to worse and you needed to escort a student, if you did it as carefully as possible, you will have done the right thing. And I think that's it for that section in terms of questions.
Thank you. Okay, so we are going to move forward here on the next section. So anything you think of, you can write in the Q&A on section 5. Okay, so given all of those behaviors we've talked about, pairing, reinforcement, functional communication training, what are the instructional considerations given all of that? And so there's a couple things I want to talk about here. So when we are pairing students up for small groups, we are going to think about, and when I say pairing, sorry, in this instance, I'm talking about groupings of students, not pairing as a behavioral strategy. So when we consider grouping of students, we can think of a couple different things to make our planning a little bit easier. So we can group students based on their ability to work independently. So if you have a small group of 2 or 3 students, you may be grouping students, one who's able to work independently and a second student who needs more adult support. You may be grouping students based on one's ability to sit for a longer period of time. You also might want to look at learner levels. So you may group your early learners together and then your more advanced learners together. Or if students are working on common skills or similar IEP goals, you may be grouping those students together when you're thinking about your planning. Another thing we want to talk about is we've all been engaged in virtual instruction for the last year, and you guys have developed really, really nice electronic materials during this time. It is okay to continue to use those electronic materials if we know that is something that is beneficial to the student. Students will be bringing their Chromebooks back and forth every day. And I think that some of these resources that have been developed by you guys are great. We certainly have students who need hands-on manipulatives. We know that the electronic materials are not the most beneficial for them, but there are certainly students who have been able to access those electronic materials, and it is okay when you're planning for instruction to continue to use some of those things. And there's some examples there on those slides. So Boom Cards, Nearpod, Google Slides, whatever you've been using within your classroom during this time, it is okay to continue to use. Okay, so now we are going to talk about prompting. So one of the big concerns and questions from staff in our discrete programs and special schools is the need for our students to need prompting. And we know that a lot of our students do need that hand over hand or physical prompting to follow routines, to have appropriate behavior, to learn. We do know that prior to COVID, it was certainly a part of our instruction on a daily basis for a lot of our students. And so when we're thinking about prompting, we are going to think about our PPE. And I think most of you have already taken the PPE training or taking it asynchronously before Monday. And so there is a link there to the PPE pyramid. And so you can certainly look at that again. As we talked about, everyone will have those PPE kits in the schools. And just remember about that when you are having to prompt a student. I also wanted to talk a little bit about glove wearing and washing hands. And so I think we all need to just consider that it is much safer to wash our hands in between working with students than it is to be wearing one pair of and touching one materials and then touching another student's materials without changing those gloves over. So our recommendation is, of course, to wash our hands often and certainly in between students. Gloves are really, we would recommend for those routines in terms of universal precautions. So when you're toileting, when you're assisting with feeding, gloves are certainly appropriate. But just for day-to-day work, when you're moving between students, washing hands will be more hygienic than using gloves without changing them.
Lauren, if I can just add, I know some staff are saying how I don't have time to wash my hands in between working with students, but that's where the hand sanitizer comes in as well. So you can use that in place of if you don't have enough time to truly wash your hands well.
Thank you, Lisa. We know that is the reality of working with our students, is that sometimes we have to be very quick. Okay, so when you are providing support or instruction, if you are able to, if a child is able to be safe to do this, you are going to sit to the side and or behind the student without restricting free movement of a student. We are going to refer to our prompt hierarchy. You see it down there very small in the corner, but you can certainly click on the link there to make it bigger. And you are going to use less restrictive prompts first. So if you look at the top of that pyramid there, there's a verbal prompt, a gestural prompt, a visual prompt, and a modeling prompt. All of those prompts are less intrusive than a physical prompt, and none of them require us touching a student. And so you really want to try to use the least restrictive prompts first. We know that there are going to be times where we have to use a physical prompt. And so some considerations for physical support would be instead of holding a student's hand, you could provide support at the forearm. You could provide support at the elbow or under the arm, or guiding a hand with your hand on their back. That being said, there are going to be times where we have to use hand over hand prompting, and we will refer to our PPE. Continue to refer to your PPE if you do need to use those physical prompts. Okay, so these are some activities or skills that you might have to avoid or modify during this time. And this is certainly not an exhaustive list. It will be a team decision that you make when you are talking to your classroom teams about what activities that you do on a daily basis with students might need to be avoided or modified. And so some of the examples we gave in this training are toothbrushing. So obviously that involves bodily fluids, spitting, all of that. It's probably not something that you will be working on in an in-person classroom during the pandemic. I do think that there may be some exceptions to that if a student is able to, for example, follow a video of toothbrushing and you're able to socially distance while that student is working on that. There may be some exceptions, but it's certainly one of those skills and skills like it that you may be having discussions about avoiding. Packing and unpacking routines. So as many of you know, you've set up your classrooms. So the general rule at most schools is that we will not be using cubbies in the primary schools or lockers in the secondary schools, and student materials will be kept within their individual workspace. And so because of that, we're really not working on packing or unpacking routines at this time. They do require movement around the room, and so that is something to think about. And then in terms of toilet training, we will be continuing to toilet our kids. If they are in diapers, we're clearly going to change them. If they have toileting needs, we're going to support them with that. But the thing is, we may modify how we are approaching toilet training. So for example, if we are toilet training a kid and we would have had them in underwear and they're having accidents, we may keep them in a diaper and continue to take them to the bathroom on a set schedule. So we're still working on toileting, but just modifying that routine. And those again will be individual decisions based on the student within your classroom. And it's just a discussion that you should have with your classroom team. So we talked about the prompt hierarchy and physical prompting and how we would like to avoid physical prompting when possible, though it will not always be possible. And so if you are physically prompting a student, here are some alternatives that we may be able to use instead of putting our hands on a student to physically prompt them. So the first one there is a step-by-step model prompt. And so an example of this would be if you are teaching a student to use deodorant, Staff might also have deodorant or a mock-up deodorant, and the staff member would take off the cap, and then the student would take off the cap. The staff would put it under their arm, and then the student would put it under their arm. So it's just a step-by-step modeling process, breaking it down further. Another alternative is video modeling. So you would record either one step of a routine at a time or a total task. And so an example of this may be washing hands. You may record a video of you first turning the water on, getting soap, and go through that step. Or you might record a video of an adult doing the entire task and then having the student follow. It would depend on the student, and you may want to build pauses into the video to allow a student to follow each step of that routine. More detailed visual schedules. So I'm going to use toothbrushing, even though I just talked about how we wouldn't be doing it, but it is a good example. Rather than one step of brushing your teeth, you may have a schedule where they were brushing each part of their mouth. And so just thinking about further breaking down visual schedules, if you know visual schedules are a strategy that work for a child. Visual cues on materials. An example of that would be if you are teaching a student to tie their shoes, you may put bright colored stickers on the shoelaces so it marks to them where they would need to pick up the shoelaces to start, so that you would not have to hand over hand physically prompt them to put their hands on those shoelaces. A laser pointer or a pen flashlight. So if you had something like this available to you, you could you could highlight, if you had a field of 3 coins or pictures of dollars on a table, and you wanted a student to select where a certain coin was, you could highlight that on with a laser pointer or a pen to prompt them to touch the correct one. If a student was using a picture communication board or a speech generating device, you may use a laser pointer or a pen flashlight to highlight where you would want them to touch if you're teaching them something. And so that's just another example. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was position prompting. And what this looks like is if you were using flashcards and you had a field of 3 pictures and you asked the student to select a certain picture, you may move the correct picture closer to the student on the table to prompt them to touch it. And so that you wouldn't have to physically hand over hand move their hand to touch the correct flashcard, or an equivalent of this could also be on a Google slide. You may move a picture closer to one area of the screen to prompt them that that's the correct answer. Okay, so there are some certain activities that we do within our classrooms that we are certainly going to have to think about how we are going to modify them. And so one of them would be work-based learning. So this is something that certainly occurs in our secondary classrooms and some of our upper elementary classrooms. And so some ideas to modify this would be having separated student materials, breaking down larger task boxes between students. So a lot of those work-based materials have a lot of materials in them. If we're able to separate them into individual tasks for students, that may be an idea. We may have students using the same materials and then rotating for the following week so that there's no shared student materials. And then certainly, as I talked about earlier, using Chromebooks for learning. I know a lot of staff have definitely come up with really great activities for work-based learning during this last year. And so you can continue to use those materials that you have created if it's beneficial for the students within your class. In terms of functional living skills, some examples of that would be having students complete those skills within their designated area. So wiping up their own desk or sanitizing their own materials instead of other areas around the school or the classroom, having them sweep their own space. Those are just 2 examples, and you can get creative with that. And then in terms of self-care, we can certainly use social stories or social narratives, and then videos, as we talked about earlier with the video modeling. Okay, so we're gonna pivot and go to schedules real quick. And so linked on these slides, and you will see them in your version of the slides as well, there are 2 schedules, one for elementary and one for secondary. And these are sample schedules that may give you an idea of how to set up your day and your classroom. And so I'm going to click the elementary schedule first. Okay, so hold on. Again, please look at this version. You can click on it through the slides so you can see it a little better. But in this schedule, we have students arriving, and then we have the arrival routine. And within each section of the schedule, we're listing out things that may be happening during that part of the day. We have a morning meeting. We have an instructional period in the morning, and then whole group instruction. 11:30 to 1 o'clock is that break where there's lunch and recess. And then there's also some other ideas up at the top of the schedule on how to occupy that time if needed. In the afternoon, you have a whole group instruction block. You have another instructional period for small groups, and then pack up dismissal. If I go to the secondary schedule here, it is set up similarly. And so you would have an arrival routine here, morning announcements, we called it instead of morning meeting. You have your morning instructional period where you have work-based learning, functional communication training, related services. You have a whole group instruction, lunch, and then that 11:30 to 1 period for movement breaks, recreation and leisure. You have a whole group instruction in the afternoon, and then another instructional period, and then pack up and dismissal. Please note that the times we have listed on here certainly will vary based on your school bell schedule. So that's definitely something to note. But I definitely suggest you go into those 2 documents, whichever one applies to you, and read it in more detail because there's a lot on there for suggestions. Okay, so that was a lot of information, but what is next? The first thing is it's really important to go back to your school teams and discuss what you've heard here today. You want to make a plan and be really consistent. And certainly you want to be on the same page with all of your colleagues. And so it's important to continue to have those conversations. I think that you're going to make a plan, and it's going to be a plan, and you're going to have to edit that plan based on what happens on a daily basis. And so just being able to be flexible, be consistent, and remember everything that we've talked about in terms of those behavioral strategies is something that is definitely the next step for you. Okay, so we are going to go to the capture sheet. Emily, Lisa, are you guys on the capture sheet? I'm still having trouble accessing it. Okay.
Yes, yes, I was just, sorry, I was just
It's okay.
punching in the last response. I was, okay, so let me go to the capture sheet and we'll look at some of the questions. Okay. There was some questions about, could I use like a long rectangular table and still maintain distancing with a pairing of 2 students? Yes, you can. It might be better to start off though with those visual boundaries. But again, if you can maintain the distance and it's safe, if you need to do that, again, you and your team should discuss that and say, well, that works for you and your students, for the staff. When you mention a small group with 2 to 3 students, is it okay not to have 6 feet of distance, and mostly when students refuse to wear a mask or face shield? So first, we should always try to maintain that distance, but then also consider the level of PPE that you might need if we're not going to be able to maintain that 6 feet of distance all the time. So obviously we want to keep the students distance, but if you have to move in and out of that boundary, that physical boundary, and you're getting closer than 6 feet, then you need to. You know that we're not going to be able to maintain that 6 feet at all times. That's why we have those different levels of PPE, and you need to make that decision. How do we write down laptops with students who might engage in some more kind of drilling behavior? Again, we need to keep things sanitary. You need to go back to your team and say, okay, how do we do this? What can we use a wipe? Those kinds of things. And again, we're not going to have the answer for everything, because sometimes I think the answer is going to be hopefully pretty easy and apparent once you get into the classroom and problem solve those questions. Probably the biggest thing is when your coffee maker dies. Yes, I agree. Talk about pairing with reinforcement. We need our reinforcements as well. Somebody asked about using of a pointer stick or laser. And the answer was, I think you can use a pointer stick or laser or a flashlight to help prompt the staff to the correct response. It looks like the mom was using the pointer stick with the student at home. Somebody said, can we use the Promethean board? Yes, but be cautious about it. Somebody said if they could get a pen for every student, if the administrator would provide that for the meeting board, sure, it's always worth an ask. It's always a good ask. I think in terms of, is there live class on Wednesday? So no, everything is virtual on Wednesday. I believe that in elementary, we're still going to have that hour-and-a-half block on Wednesday morning, and then it reverts to asynchronous. For secondary, I'm not 100% sure. Lauren or Lisa, do you have a more definitive answer than I have on that?
My understanding is that the ALO programs will continue what they're doing on Wednesday mornings, which is some form of virtual instruction, and then the remainder doing asynchronous learning, whether it's elementary or secondary. That's my understanding.
That
Yes.
is very confused right now, but Lisa, you're correct for now, and there is a huge effort to clarify messages going forward. But I think for sure for the next few weeks, we are going to continue in ALO programs what we have been doing up to this point. I saw a question about a refrigerator.
Yeah, I was
and
gonna, yeah.
I think it's just a very common sense question, and I would propose that you propose a common sense response to it. So there's been a lot of varying guidance about microwaves, refrigerators, etc., because they're high touch surfaces. I think that we know that sometimes our kids have to have their food refrigerated, and if that's the case, I would propose that you approach your administrator with a common sense plan to clean it. We have a set of wipes that we just put in our common refrigerator in our office. We're going to wipe the handles. I'm assuming you're not going to let kids in it, but I think that people want very much to accommodate and support, but they want to know that you're going to be safe and careful. So take a proposal to your administrator and say, I really need my refrigerator. Here's what I want to do about it.
There seems to be a lot of questions about cross-contamination. And I know one of the other professional development, there was a slide that talked about surface transmission, and that the research now is a little bit different than what it was. Chris, do you want to address that at all? Sorry to put you on the spot.
So it's very clear that surface transmission is not as much of an issue as we thought originally when we were all wiping down our groceries or whatever we were all doing at the beginning of the pandemic. It is still a concern, and I think that we're waiting for county guidance to really catch up with the science to an extent. So I think that if it's an issue about meeting the needs of a student who needs something refrigerated, then you propose that common sense, I promise I'll clean the handle of the refrigerator response. But I think we're pushing it if we ask to use coffee machines as desperately as we all need coffee. I think we're going to have to bring our own. I think the same might hold true about a microwave. If your student has to have something heated and the microwave is the way to do it, go to your administrator, say, I intend to clean it the following way, but I wouldn't fight too much about the microwave for your own lunch right now.
I think that was the gist of the questions, if it's okay to move on. Okay, so we are going to do attendance here. I'm going to post the attendance into the chat. And I'm going to walk you through some of it here. So if you're able to click on that link, make sure that you mark the correct session under addressing challenging behaviors. There is a nice typo in there where under addressing challenging behaviors, it says Wednesday, February 24th instead of Thursday, February 25th, which is today. Please click the Wednesday session. There was not a Wednesday session. Do not click one of the Saturday sessions. You are attending Wednesday, which is technically Thursday. We apologize for that typo. Make sure you're going to live course as well. And then submit. If you are having trouble with the attendance, you can stay on and we can see if we can help troubleshoot with you. Or you can email us. But if not, you are free to go once you do that attendance form. Thank you.
We do
Thank you
encourage
so
you to
much,
do it right
everyone.
now so that you can get paid.
Right. It's the only
Yeah.
way. This is your payment. So make sure you do that attendance.
And thank you for your participation. Great questions. Thank you.
Thank you for being a great group.
Thank you. Stop recording.
Mhm.